In this video, we're going to venture into the 20th century within our course and within the history of modern China. And I want to begin this class with a passage by a writer that we encountered in a previous video and that my class at Stanford is reading as part of this class. And this is a passage by Lu Xun. I had seen the 1911 revolution, the Second Revolution, Yuan Shikai's assumption of the imperial title, and Zhang Xun's restoration, and all this made me have doubts. So I gave up hope and became very despondent. What's key about this passage is not only all of the revolutionary tumult that Lu Xun is referring to, some of which you know, some of which you've never heard of, and we'll get to in this course, but also this idea of despondence. And just as a foreshadowing, this despondence with politics, the sense of hopelessness as to the ability of politics to effect change, will be a major driving force for this period known as the New Culture Movement, or the May 4th movement in the 19-teens in China, in which so many, not just Lu Xun, but so many turned away from politics, and in Lu Xun's case, turned away from the sciences and medical sciences. That was a bit of an exception, towards the realm of culture, whether arts or poetry or journalism or playwriting and whatever it is, because not because they wanted to escape from politics or take refuge from it, but they began to believe that culture was actually the main battleground for the in which the future of the country would be determined. So in essence, you can read this passage, and again, I'm foreshadowing here, that look at all of these revolutions. We had the revolution that overthrew the Qing dynasty. That's what we wanted as revolutionaries. We had all of these other basically betrayals of the revolution, or all of these some sort of semi-comical moments in this post-revolutionary moment. And all of this raises the question, dear God, if revolution cannot bring about the political goals that we want as activists, as radicals, as revolutionaries, what does that mean? Maybe it means that we need to work on transforming the consciousness of the average Chinese person, and maybe that transformation of consciousness is a prerequisite for any lasting political change. But we're going to kind of explore this passage, or use it as something to think with over this video. Now, just as a quick set of reminders, in 1905, the Tongmenghui, sometimes translated as the Revolutionary Alliance, it's more like kind of a confederation of disparate political groups, whether parties or kind of political activist groups, that really share very little in common except for their desire to overthrow the Qing dynasty and replace it with another form of government, whether republicanism or otherwise. And it was founded in Japan, of all places. And this, if you did not yet see the video on the question of why did Lu Xun have his political awakening in Tokyo, of all places, please do watch that video, because this is related, that Tokyo and other cities in Japan were at this time something of a safe haven for political radicals from China, but also from other parts of East Asia and even other parts of the world. So Tokyo was really needs to take its place alongside Paris, or alongside a variety of other kind of major global cities, where radicals from around the world found brief safe haven and started journals and started societies and started various kinds of political agitation. But it really is something that the Tongmenghui, which will later become the Nationalist Party, this is like the Nationalist Party under Sun Yat-sen, under Chiang Kai-shek, this party that will be, it still is today, one of the most important parties in Taiwan, was founded in this radical safe haven of Tokyo at a time when any of the members here, had they set foot in Beijing, back in Beijing, they would have been arrested and executed. So, as a reminder, the Tongmenghui Revolutionary Proclamation of 1907, I'm not going to dwell on that, but you can get a sense again of how the 1911 revolution was premised, at least in part, on ideas of racism, social Darwinism, the competition of the races, extinction, and in this case, the portrayal was of the Manchus as this kind of Mongoloid race that had been unjustly ruling Han Chinese people for all this time, and that they needed to be overthrown, not only because they were misadministering the empire, they were clearly failing not only to Western powers but also even Japan, but even more importantly is that they were Manchu, not Han. So this emerging idea of a kind of Han, almost a Han racism that we see. We talked about how the Qing court, in this sort of 11th hour scramble, tried to get ahead of this revolutionary sentiment, this sentiment that was emerging, especially in the wake of the Boxer uprising and the military occupations that followed, but even before that, with Qing China's loss in the war against Japan in 1894-95, there was a growing number of people who were calling for the outright overthrow of the Qing dynasty, not merely its reform. And the Qing court was aware of this, and they tried from early 1900s, but certainly 1905 onward, to implement all of these pretty radical changes in order to try to get ahead of this. And yet this, of course, does not stem the tide of revolutionary activism and uprisings. So Sun Yat-sen, in his early life, is part of a number of failed uprisings against the Qing. Not just him, but a number of others are attempting to overthrow the Qing. Each one of these uprisings is crushed, and those who take part are either incarcerated and executed or flee for their lives, as Sun Yat-sen did after the 1895 coup. And it is also around this time when Sun Yat-sen will articulate a very vague set of principles known as the Three People's Principles, but perhaps because of its vagueness and because many different political actors and parties can sort of imbue this rather abstract structure with their own meanings. Nevertheless, this Three People's Principles of nationalism, democracy, and what sometimes is translated as people's welfare, although it has also been translated by some as socialism, was articulated by Sun around this time as, in essence, a model of political legitimacy that would replace the notion of the heavenly mandate. We are no longer interested in a political system in which the ruler's legitimacy or right to rule derives from heaven. That the ruler's right to rule, the government's right to rule, must derive from the people. And so how do we theorize that principle? Well, Sun Yat-sen articulated something of that nature. So, we remember that the 1911 revolution breaks out in Wuhan, in kind of southern central China, in this tri-city complex of Wuhan. And as I explained in the earlier video, there's absolutely nothing to say that this outbreak, this anti-Qing outbreak, should have been any different than 1895, than 1900, than 1907. There is always within history contingency. Sometimes historians abuse that term. Sometimes historians get a little bit lazy and cite it as kind of a principle of historical analysis. It's not. Contingency really refers to complexity, to complexity that far exceeds our all too human efforts to try to model them and discipline that. But there is something contingent about this, so hyper complex, in the sense that one could imagine an alternate universe in which 1907 was the definitive moment, and that we would now, in the year 2020, not be referring to the 1911 revolution, but to the 1907 revolution. And what's even more sort of mind-melting is that it is very possible that the 1911 revolution, although it may have kind of succeeded in its immediate goals of overthrowing the Qing, might have been supplanted by some other date. And we might say that now 1911 was an important moment, but the real moment was, I don't know, the 1913 revolution. So this is the constant check that we as historians have to place on ourselves to avoid teleological, preordained arguments. That would be, we know through retrospect that 1911 was a pivotal moment, and therefore we tell all our stories of 1911 as if it were inevitable, but it wasn't. There was a pronounced anti-Manchu violence, which was kind of core to the chaos of 1911. Just as a reminder that this was an ethnically and even racially motivated or inflected kind of revolution. It was ostensibly about replacing imperial with republican government, but it was also profoundly anti-Manchu in this. And we talked briefly about Jiaoren and some other who advocated for these hyper racialized, hyper social Darwinist views of the world. Now, the abdication of the Qing came in short order once the wave of secessions of various provinces, but also large kind of municipalities, really took any military option off the table for the Qing. There was no way that they were going to recreate, as it were, the history of the 1640s and the 1650s and 1660s, which we discussed before, by which I mean recreate this massive military conquest of southern China. It just wasn't in the cards. They did not have that kind of military capacity. And so instead, the real question by a certain point in 1911 was, how are we going to survive this cataclysm? And by we, I mean the Qing court. Are people going to storm the Forbidden City and butcher us? Are we going to be imprisoned? Do we need to flee for our lives? And then more optimistically, are we permitted to stay in the Forbidden City even though we hold no power? All of these were questions. And the key figure in this is a man that we have met before, this man, Yuan Shikai, who we first met in the video on the Boxer uprising, the Boxer suppression. Remember, it is Yuan Shikai who is installed as the governor of Shandong after the dismissal of Yu Xian, who manages, and under Yuan Shikai, he manages to kind of subdue this Boxer tumult in his province, but kick those Boxers out into the neighboring province of Zhili, and with it, the city of Beijing. But in any event, he plays this pivotal role as this intermediary between the two sides of this conflict in 1911, the Qing court and then this largely kind of ragtag, loose association of revolutionaries. The key here is that both of these sides realized that they could not win this through any conventional means. The Qing could not win and destroy the revolution that was breaking out through military means, but the revolutionaries were suffering profound losses, and they were extremely weakened. They could not simply, through military means, take over Qing China. So both sides were at this weakened, exhausted phase where they could see that they needed a way out. Well, Yuan Shikai positioned himself very deftly as that figure, and by means of it helped negotiate the terms of the abdication of the Qing court, but also managed to secure for himself the eventual presidency of the republic to come. So although Sun Yat-sen will be in this sort of titular first president and the father of the revolution, Yuan Shikai is going to be the first acting president of the republic to come, and we're going to see what he does with that presidency. Okay, so just so we kind of have this straight and where we are, these kinds of calculations I always really like when historians give them to me. 1911 is as far away from 1644, the foundation of the Qing dynasty, or when the Qing controls or Beijing, let's say, because the Qing itself is formed a few years earlier, but yeah, is as far away from 1644 as 2019 or 2020 is from 1752, which I looked it up, and that's when Franklin conducted his experiments with electricity. Anyway, this is an immense span of time, far beyond the living memory of any of the historical actors we're dealing with, but it just gives us some perspective. When we do a class and we zip through time, we can lose sight of this and imagine that things are a lot closer in time than they actually are. Okay, well, what were the post-imperial hopes of the revolutionaries? There were three by and large. This ethno-national idea of China for the Chinese, so the restoration of Han Chinese control, let's say, political reform and participation, so a greater stake in the governance of this polity, this now republic, and sovereignty and anti-imperialism. We need to get control of our borders again, and we need to reestablish sovereignty in the face of this, basically by this point, this European, largely European and Japanese feeding frenzy in all different parts of the empire and now republic. So we're going to look at the report card for the early republic on these three accounts. This is our teaching rubric, let's say. So Yuan Shikai is an interesting figure. He is a child during the Taiping Rebellion. He too attempted in his early life to kind of travel the conventional path. He attempted twice to take the civil service examination, but he did something which was a harbinger of things to come, which is that he pursued a military career instead. Now, I say that is, I cite that as an exceptional thing because it was. Conventionally speaking, in early modern, late imperial China, a career in the army was not something that anyone wanted their children to do. Certainly no family of any means would ever dream that a career in the military carried any prestige, any reputation. This was something that kind of, illiterate country bumpkins and the poor did, not something that, a family of any standing or any aspiration would ever try, and secure for their family. But this was changing. Because of the commitment, of these profound commitment from the Tongzhi Restoration onward, the prestige of the military within China slowly and then more quickly begins to increase. The formation of the Jiangnan Arsenal, the association of modernity and modernization with, for example, Prussian military advisors or British naval advisors, the sending abroad of students to study, military tactics or engineering and weapons design and so forth and so on, slowly began to change the valence of a military career from something that only a poor fool would do to something that would be a respectable career that actually could carry avenues into power. And so it's very interesting. So Yuan Shikai begins his pathway in Li Hongzhang's army. So this is the army that is born out of the need to destroy the Taiping threat, and he continues his pathway through there. So it's by way of a military career, not through civil service examination, that he becomes a very important statesman in the Qing dynasty, first as a key diplomat in Korea in the 1880s, and then we've already talked about his role in the Boxers. So he is he's an interesting figure who is a harbinger of those we're going to see, and those we're about to see, for example, include Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek also found his way into political power by way of an officer, a career as a military officer. So the prestige of the military is changing completely during this time. Okay, so let's get back to the report card. Let's look at China for the Chinese first. And of course, one of the things we have to ask ourselves is, who is Chinese? So if we were to go back in time and look at the territories of the Ming Dynasty and the territories of the Qing Dynasty. So in this map, the whole thing, including that big white blob and all those colored pieces, that is the Qing at its greatest expanse, and all of those provinces that I've colored in are the territories of the former Ming. So just as a reminder, the Qing Dynasty vastly expands the territory of the empire. So now the question becomes, now that we want to become a republic, a Chinese republic, what counts? We've had figures like Zhang Bingling and Zhou Rong and others who espoused all of this just dark, violent, racist, genocidal ideas vis-a-vis Manchus, but does that mean that therefore Manchus are not part of this China we want to build? What about Tibetans? What about Mongols? What about those barbarians in southwest China? And I put that in quotes because that was the terminology that would be used. Who is this Chinese for whom we want to secure China? This is a big question, and I already talked about the issue of territorial disintegration in another video, so I won't dwell on that. But suffice it to say that on this point, the report card for the early republic was pretty dismal. In the opening few years of the republic, so right after the revolution of 1911 and the foundation of the republic in basically January 1st, 1912, more or less, we lose Mongolia, which remains an independent country to the present day. Tibet basically falls off the map in terms of the orbit of Beijing. Even southwest China, some parts of which had been deeply integrated in, say, Ming Dynasty China, are also announcing their independence in a variety of ways. And then, of course, we still have all of these colonial forces, imperial forces, Japan, Russia, France, United Kingdom, United States, Germany, all, extremely active and still making inroads into the empire. So as Lucien Bianco put it kind of dramatically, from 1894 to 1911, but this really extends into the early republic, rival imperialists swarmed over China's enormous decaying corpse. So Lucien, said it here. So in essence, something that was going to confront the regime in Beijing in the post-imperial crisis was are we going to try to keep the territories that the Manchu Qing added to the map, really to the orbit of Beijing? Are we going to make the case that China contains Tibet, or contains Xinjiang, or contains Inner Mongolia, Manchuria? Or do we want to retract to something like a territory of the Ming Dynasty, which would be largely coterminous with this idea of Han Chinese? Well, very quickly, it's decided that yes, we want to keep it all. We want to keep, the Qing map and transform it into a Chinese map, a Republic of China. Well, this was going to require the regime in Beijing to develop their own technique, their own political methods and theories. Theories of political legitimacy that would enable them to rightfully rule over Tibetans. Why is it wrong, fundamentally, for a Manchu to rule over a Han, but it's right for a Han to rule over a Tibetan? What's up with that? Well, Sun Yat-sen and the others within this, and also Yuan Shikai and others within this new government, were going to have to come up with their own idea. And as I mentioned in a previous video, they tried. And one of the things that they articulated was this idea that the Chinese Republic was a republic of 5 peoples, sometimes translated as a republic of 5 races. And they even adopted this flag, which was supposed to convey this idea of unity in diversity. And so what's funny here is that as soon as all this just profoundly violent, racist, anti-Manchu, genocidal language of Zhorong serves its purpose, let's say, very quickly figures like Sun Yat-sen and others are like, oh, no, we don't want to kill you all. We're a republic of 5 peoples. And what they're doing is, in essence, stealing a page from the Qing Dynasty playbook and saying that we look upon all of the constituents of our republic, not our empire, equally, and we're all parts of this empire. So, ironically, very similar to what the Qing had done with all of this simultaneous emperorship business that we talked about earlier. Okay. Well, China for the Chinese, I would say that, the early republic has, at best, a C-, maybe a D+ on this. And this is not Yuan Shikai's fault, per se. These are dynamics that are in the works well before 1911. And really what we're seeing is the inertia of those forces. A body in motion stays in motion. So this kind of disintegration, and also these colonial including in domestic internal kind of variables, but also these powerful variables of imperialist intervention are still at play. So we can't just load everything on Yuan Shikai, although it was on his watch. This brings us to the second part of our kind of report card pertaining to political reform and participation. And on this particular element, I'm afraid that Yuan Shikai's report card is particularly dark, let's say. So we can tell this story by way of a man named Song Jiaoren, born in 1882, and I invite you to look at the date of death for Song, 1913. That's going to become relevant in a moment. So Song is a pivotal figure, a co-founder of the Tongmenghui in Japan. He's part of this radical revolutionary circle, these agitators. He is an advocate of republicanism, of a parliamentary democracy, and he is also a pivotal figure in the transformation of this ragtag kind of group of political parties, this Tongmenghui, this alliance of parties, its transformation into a single, still internally quite diverse party called the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party. And this is the Nationalist Party of Chiang Kai-shek later on, and in fact, that would be the leading political party in Taiwan for most of its modern history. So that's the kind of role that he's playing. Now, we need to remember that Yuan Shikai negotiated for himself the presidency of the Republic, but this was under agreement that there would be, in short order, an election. And so, although Yuan Shikai was not elected to this position, the kind of radicals or revolutionaries and Republicans like Song Jiaoren could accept this because there was looming on the horizon an election by which someone could compete with Yuan Shikai and perhaps gain office or gain the presidency. Now, during the campaign, Song Jiaoren was really a leading figure, a leading candidate within the campaign, and the nationalists, the Kuomintang Party, did very well in this campaign, winning a majority of seats. And so, what this meant, in effect, is that short of something cataclysmic, Song Jiaoren was quite likely going to assume a top post in government. Well, something cataclysmic did happen, which is that practically moments later, in an historical perspective, Song Jiaoren is shot by an assassin and dies 2 days later. And it is widely assumed at the time and widely believed in retrospect that this was at the behest of Yuan Shikai. He basically had murdered a political rival whose star was rising and who threatened his position, and also the fact that the Nationalist Party had its star rising and would, short of this kind of action, have taken over government in the Republic. Well, this assassination triggers widespread distress and further rebellions against Yuan Shikai's rule. I mean, in effect, it was a kind of second rebellion, second revolution against Yuan Shikai. Yuan's response to this was to militarily suppress and through police action suppress these rebellions, and then he kind of systematically undertook a series of prohibitions and changes to government that betrayed his long-standing commitment to highly centralized government. Yuan Shikai is a tricky figure to pin down. On the one hand, he is definitely committed to deep infrastructural change. He is a modernizer. Like, he believes deeply in the need for the Qing before this and now the Republic to undertake some painful reforms in order to establish itself on the national stage, international stage, and so forth. But he is allergic to parliamentary democracy. He fundamentally really doesn't believe in ideas of liberal democracy involving kind of a large-scale participation in government. And what we see following the sponsored assassination of Song Jiaoren is a series of prohibitions that betray that political inclination. In the summer of 1913, he bans public meetings. He is then re-elected president in a sort of cooked vote. He then proceeds to ban the Nationalist Party itself, the Kuomintang. In the beginning of 1914, dissolves parliament. To top it off, Yuan Shikai's final act was, in the eyes of those who had agitated for change, or those who had taken part in the revolution, those who had attempted revolution and fled for their lives, constituted the ultimate betrayal, which is, in December 1915, Yuan Shikai declared himself Emperor of China. Now, there's a whole lot to this, and I'm not gonna delve in too deeply here, but this adoption of the title of emperor, and of this, even the promulgation of a reign name and all of these sorts of things, was motivated by many, many different factors. One, undoubtedly, is Yuan Shikai's total distrust, or kind of lack of faith in parliamentary, republican, liberal, democratic processes. But it's also inflected by the persistent question of whether or not China should transform from an empire into something like a constitutional monarchy. Whether or not there should still be something like an imperial figure, not unlike we see in Japan, but also not unlike we see in Great Britain, and in many other modernizing, industrializing nations on Earth. And for Yuan's part, he had a number of advisors around him, including one very prominent foreign advisor, this man Goodnow, who claimed, basically on behalf of the Chinese people, that the Chinese people are not ready for democracy. They have baked into their worldview the emperor, an imperial worldview, and that, in fact, the general public, the Chinese public, would welcome an act by Yuan Shikai naming himself emperor, because it would sort of coincide with this deep-seated, deeply entrenched assumption that we need an emperor. Well, this was a profound miscalculation on behalf of Yuan Shikai. He and his advisors had profoundly misread the moment, and misread how deeply entrenched the commitment now was to getting past imperial forms and into those of republicanism, constitutionalism, parliamentary democracy, and the like. But what's interesting is that there was this brief period. We often say that the Qing dynasty was the last Chinese dynasty, and technically speaking, it wasn't. There was this brief Hongxian reign of Yuan Shikai. And what's amazing is that in the British Museum, there is even a work of porcelain in which the imperial stamp of Yuan Shikai's reign is there. So, I include this just for your own amusement. Well, in any event, no one found this amusing really at the within China. This assumption of the imperial title prompts yet another widespread reaction, in which, in essence, there's another wave of secessions really from Beijing. Yuan Shikai tries to walk this back. Tries to walk back the imperial assumption, the assumption of the imperial title, but really it's just simply too late. And by this point, one could argue that he has lost all legitimacy in the eyes of major provincial leaders, and his actions had confirmed the suspicions and fears of figures like Sun Yat-sen and certainly Song Jiaoren, now dead, that could this person be trusted with the presidency of the republic? Would he actually turn it over? Would he willingly accept the outcome of an election and peacefully transfer power, or was he a megalomaniac and would throw the country into distress and unrest? It's a little uncanny. So anyway, this is the moment in which Yuan Shikai dies. He dies of natural causes, but in the midst of this turmoil, having thrown the promises of the 1911 revolution really largely out the window, dies, exits the stage of history, and leaves behind him chaos, leaves behind a sense of chaos. This is the beginning of what is known as the warlord period in China. Yuan Shikai had thrown the republic into such disarray that it would take more than a decade for another regime to establish centralized control. And even then, much of that control was paper thin. So arguably, from this moment, from the Yuan Shikai betrayal of the revolution, It would take all the way to the 1950s for another regime, i.e. the Chinese Communists, to reestablish a centralized control of the country, following this immediate betrayal of the revolution. In the next video, we're going to examine China's role in the First World War.